You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on.
It's the 8th of July 1993 in Frankston, Victoria. Newborn Jake Blair is sleeping soundly in his home at 27 Cananook Avenue, Seaford. His mum and dad, Deborah Fream and Gary Blair, have spent the past 12 days basking in the joy of the birth of their son and first-time parenthood. On this particular night, Gary is still at work and Debbie's in the kitchen with a friend making dinner. It's around 7:20 p.m. when she realises she's run out of milk for the omelette she's preparing. Debbie decides to duck out to the local milk bar. It's only 600 metres away, and if she drives, Debbie should be gone only a few minutes. Jake is fast asleep, and Debbie's friend doesn't mind holding down the fort briefly. So she jumps in the car. But 22-year-old Deborah Fream never returns. She'll never hold her son again. She'll never cook another dinner with friends. She'll never marvel with Gary at the love-filled home they've built. When Deborah's body is found days later, not only does it plunge her family into unimaginable grief, it reveals an even more sinister possibility, as police are forced to confront their worst fear. Debbie is the second female murder victim in a matter of weeks. Frankston has a serial killer on their hands. A killer who is still at large and who will kill again.
Always wanted to kill. Since I was about 14.
It's been almost 30 years since Paul Denyer violently and callously took the lives of 22-year-old Deborah Fream, 18-year-old Elizabeth Stevens, and 17-year-old Natalie Russell. His crimes terrorised the Frankston community, and decades later, the harm he caused is as real and raw for some as it was in 1993.
It's just something you don't get over. It's you learn to get out of bed every morning and put one foot in front of the other, but it's there in front of you all the time.
She was a vibrant, happy, intelligent girl, and the places she would have gone.
But as of the 11th of April 2023, Paul Denyer is eligible for parole, meaning that any day now, the serial killer responsible for the Frankston murders could walk free.
What we're asking the government to do is to make sure that Paul Denyer stays locked up forever.
I'm Emma Gillespie, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. 51-year-old Paul Charles Denyer has spent the past 3 decades behind bars after the brutal murders of 3 young women in Melbourne's Frankston area. Their names were Elizabeth Stevens, Deborah Fream, and Natalie Russell. But Paul Denyer's psychopathic, violent nature was not limited to these 3 killings. From abduction and attempted murder to stalking, intimidation, and the deliberate and gruesome killing of pet animals like domestic cats and kittens and bunny rabbits. Paul Denyer's perversions know no limits. His long list of victims stretches far and wide. But as we record this, a parole board in Victoria must consider an application to free the man behind the Frankston murders. Described by a judge as the reason a parent looks anxiously at the clock because their child is running late, the reason women quicken their step on the way home, Paul Denyer is seeking freedom, as the families of his victims are forced once again to fight to protect the women of Frankston and beyond. The same group who are absolutely convinced that if given the chance, Paul Denyer will kill again. Award-winning crime writer Vikki Petraitis was on patrol with police the night Denya's final murder took place. She wrote the best-selling book The Frankston Murders, which was published in 1994 and has since been republished across multiple editions. Most recently, Vikki revisited The Frankston Murders in a long-form podcast series by the same name, speaking directly to those who fought to bring Denya to justice and those who continue to honour the lives of Elizabeth, Deborah and Natalie. In working to shine a spotlight on the women at the heart of this case, Vikki has also uncovered new information about Denya's twisted behaviour and violent nature. She joins us today. And an important note before we start. In the past, the Frankston serial killer has identified as female, something we'll discuss in this episode. But this is no longer the case. So throughout today's episode, we'll be using the male name and male pronouns. Now, Vikki, you literally wrote the book on Paul Denya and his crimes nearly 30 years ago, and now you've released this long-form podcast all about it. The timing is significant though, because Paul Denya is up for parole. He is eligible as of this week. Is it a surprise to you that that is even a possibility?
We always knew that he would apply for parole because every letter that I've ever seen that people have showed me, he's only written me personally one letter, but all the other letters that I've seen, he always talks about, when I get out, this is the kind of car I'm going to drive. And when I get out, I'm going to come to your house for a barbecue, he said to a woman that wrote to him in prison. And so I knew he had this expectation of release. And then he applied, he took us all by surprise. I started making the podcast last year thinking, okay, this is year 29. He's going to apply next year. He can apply from July. But of course, with the pandemic, if prisoners don't get the allocated time out of their cells every day, and because prisons were short-staffed because of COVID, he had these prisoner management days where it's kind of like a day off in lieu. And so to everybody's absolute horror, he put the application in last October, which was like 29 years and 3 months. So it just knocked the families for a six. But I'd already been working on my podcast for a year. It was really close to being finished. And what we did is we timed it for his parole hearing, which could happen any time after the 11th. So it's very, very topical. And I think it's ripped the Band-Aid off this for so many people in the area who were affected. And I'm just getting inundated with messages from people saying, I live near him, or I knew Natalie, or everyone has a personal story about their connection. And this is why the podcast has had 729,000 downloads in less than 2 weeks. It's been a bit unbelievable.
Does that interest that you've seen speak to a certain shock in the community that we could be having a conversation about this brutal serial killer possibly walking free? Is there just a sense of disbelief?
I think that, like me, most people are 99% certain that he will never be released because he's too dangerous. But there's always that 1% where we know offenders like Adrian Bailey were released and went on to kill Jill Maher. And so there is that 99%, no, they'll never let him out, and the 1% absolute fear and horror that maybe they could. And this is what people are responding to. It's fear.
You mentioned that so many personal stories have been shared with you, people coming forward in the process of making your podcast to tell you how Paul Denya impacted their life. He has, of course, the victims of the 3 women murdered on that list. But can you give me a bit of an insight into his other crimes, the impact, the ripple effect of what he did, what he's capable of doing that extend beyond those 3 women?
Yeah, I think making the podcast helped me understand that better because I spent a lot of time with the families of the victims and advocating for them and telling the stories of the 3 women. But what I didn't fully understand was the extent of his stalking, the extent of his confrontations with women just on the streets, And I think I understand better now that he really got off on the power of making people scared. And I just had somebody message me today talking about that his family lived in the same street as Debbie and that they would go to the milk bar, and his whole childhood, it's almost stained by the fear that they could never go to that milk bar ever again for their $1 of lollies. You know, in the olden days, you're probably too young, but you used to get your little white bag of mixed lollies, and everything is then stained by the fact that that was where Debbie was taken from. And so from these tiny ripple effects to much bigger ones, where I interviewed several people that were connected with him attacking people from the supermarket where he worked. So from following women home from the supermarket, from ramming women and babies and children with shopping trolleys. He starts where he works, and then he starts where he lives. So the kindergarten that had their rabbits murdered and left for the children to find was literally 2 doors down from where his family lived in Langwarrin. They had probably moved away by that time, but it's 2 doors down from where he's very, very familiar. When he moves on to Frankston Dandenong Road, he breaks into his next door neighbour's house, who he was friends with, who he would go to coffee with at her house and have long, long conversations. And then he chooses her house to break in and out of for weeks before he does the final stabbing of her clothing and cutting up of her bed and carving messages into her furniture and cutting her throat on all of her photos. This is his next door neighbour. And then she moved out, and then he goes to the next unit down in the same block and starts having coffee with a woman called Donna, who lived with her sister Tricia for a while. So when it comes time to ever thinking about putting him out on the streets, where do you put him? Because we know that in the past he targets people from where he lives and where he works. So that's something that I didn't have a full appreciation of before I did the podcast. And it was only hearing story after story after story that it's like, bloody hell.
Many of the sinister stereotypes of a serial killer fit the bill perfectly with the character of Paul Denyer. What do we understand about his motivations, his childhood and environment? What drove him to take the lives of the 3 young women, to kill family pets, to stalk and intimidate women, and, you know, everything else that we've heard about?
He blamed it on being sexually assaulted by his brother. I don't think the story is as simple as that. I think that you sometimes can just get the perfect storm in a person. And when we look back and we look at the kind of behaviours that he did at school, he was a fairly quiet student who didn't want to do much. And I think the teachers in the olden days would have called him lazy. He didn't really participate. But then there were moments of intense violence where he would snap and assault another child and then go back to kind of shrugging it off or laughing about it. And he didn't have a lot of friends. He came from a big family. So if you have a big family, you know that sometimes that can be your friends, like that's your social group. And he certainly did some very, very odd things. It's like he developed as a young teenager into wanting to do this. So how that's created, I guess, academically, he was dropped on his head when he was a baby, so sometimes head injuries connected with this. Certainly abuse never, ever helps. And then you just get this perfect storm.
Those who you've interviewed who actually met Paul seem to describe 2 very different people. There are some who say he had this icy stare, the eyes of a killer, a really cold sort of a person. And then there are others who say he seemed like a really happy-go-lucky young guy, a neighbourly person, that they enjoyed having coffee with him and chatting with him. Why do you think that is?
I think what you've hit on is something really important. With Paul, there seems to be this duality of the hero and the villain. And one pattern that came across really clearly is that when I do talks, people will come up afterwards and say, I worked with his girlfriend Sharon, and I'll never forget that he would come into work to pick her up and he would say really loudly, does anyone want me to walk them to their car? There's a serial killer out there. He does it to Donna Vaines after her flat is broken into, and then when the murders are happening, he's going, Donna, don't you worry, I'll protect you. So there's this really interesting component to him of playing the hero. One story that he had was that he heard a woman scream one night and he saved her from being raped. And the woman screaming at a train station, this story, I wonder now whether he was actually alluding to Sarah McDermott. But he certainly wanted to be seen as the hero, but he was the villain. So this is another part of the complexities of him that are really hard to understand. But I think on that level, you get it, that he's creating this panic, but then he says to women, don't worry, I'll look after you. And it's like, you're the fear, buddy, you're the fear.
I want to go back to that night in 1993 when a young schoolgirl was found dead. You were particularly close to this case in a police ride-along on the night. What can you tell me about the sense of fear in the community at that point, and then the fallout of this third body, this third girl?
I think we all felt very helpless that night because of all the police and all of the resources that had been put into Frankston. And I'll never forget, and I haven't really told this story much before because it was just one of those things that it's unbelievable on so many levels. But at the end of the bike track, there's a school, Monterey Tech, and there was a school oval. And I'll never forget the cop that I was on the ride along with. He came over and he's going, bloody hell, there's this girl, this teenager was just walking across the oval. So this is in the dead of night and it's pitch black. And all of a sudden she has been set upon by about, I don't know, I say 1,000 police, I'm exaggerating, but there's a lot of police sort of looming out of the shadows, and they've jumped at this kid and going, what the hell are you doing? She's like, I'm just walking home. And they said, there's a serial killer out there. And the cops were really angry that she would be taking those kind of risks, but it's like, but everybody still has to live. And here these teenagers that are just trying to, go out on a Friday night and walk home and have no idea of how close they are to a murder scene. But I think that sort of duality there sums up what that was like, because some people didn't take those warnings. And I guess, for women and for feminists, it's like, I should have the right to walk the streets at night. But in Frankston in 1993, for those 7 weeks, it was really, really dangerous.
When police realised their worst fears, that in fact this serial killer that they had been pursuing had killed again, what was the sense from the investigators that you were around at that time?
There was a sense of panic in the media, like serial killer. And what that does is it falls directly on their shoulders, because they already have the pressure that all investigators have. If there's a killer on the loose, they don't have a day off. Charlie Bazina talks about working 7 weeks straight without a day off, early in the morning till late at night, and they can't rest because the safety of women is in their hands. And I think that there was absolute mayhem and sorrow because this is a schoolgirl. What they also had was they had an inkling that he had changed his patterns because the cuts had been made in the wire fence beforehand. He's preparing for these killings now. The other ones were snatch and grab type killings, but these, he's laying in wait, he's targeting someone, he's following them and just pouncing, and in broad daylight. But of course, Denyer got very cocky and he left evidence at the scene, and certainly in the post-mortem examination there was a piece of skin that did not belong to Natalie that they felt might have come from the offender cutting himself during the attack. And also he was seen at the end of the bike track by a postal worker who'd gone into a house, reported a man looking really suspicious, crouching down in the seat, and by the time the police came to check his car, he had gone, but the car was still there. So, of course, the minute that the police that had checked the car that Friday afternoon, the minute they came on shift, found out that a girl had been murdered, these two cops went up to command and they said, look, we checked a car right near the bike track, reports of a suspicious male, and they were able to check that car straight away and catch him. So with Natalie, we didn't have the time as a community or as investigators to have the full-blown panic and the full-blown, oh my God, there's definitely a serial killer, because he was caught the next day.
The tactics that you mentioned, Paul had sort of shifted gears towards that this final murder had more signs of premeditation. Can you tell me about how that differed to the first victims, how they were taken, the circumstances of those attacks?
Well, with the first victim, he always maintained that he saw Elizabeth get off the bus and it was just a chance encounter. He grabbed her, told her that he had a gun, walked her around to Lloyd Park, around the corner from where she lived, and murdered her there. I've always thought there was a bit more to that story. She had strange markings cut into her torso. Her aunt and uncle had reported that she'd been followed a couple of weeks earlier. They had bought the house from the family of Paul's brother's girlfriend. Paul used to go to that exact same house. So when you talk about was it random, officially, sure, it was random, and he said that it was random. But he didn't ever talk about that connection with the house, that he'd been there before, that he'd followed. But we know, of course, with his pattern, he did follow women. So you've got to wonder whether or not that was as random as what he thought. But officially, it was random. With Debbie, he had earlier that night tried to attack a woman called Rosa at the Seaford railway station just as she got off the train, and it was a snatch and grab. And it was at night, but it was when she's walking along, there's cars going past, and he just grabs her, and it was a really, really brutal attack. When she breaks free, flags down a car, he simply pops himself on the train and then goes down to the next stop down. And then you've got Debbie Fream, a young mum of a 12-day-old baby, is stopping at the milk bar in McCulloch Avenue to get milk, and he jumps into the back of her car. So really it was victims of opportunity. But with Natalie, it was laying in wait. And we know that serial killers progress in their techniques. And this is why with Sarah McDermott, who went missing in 1990, people say it can't be Paul because, the other bodies have been found. But if Paul did kill Sarah McDermott, did he conceal her and then realise afterwards that there's no fun and excitement for him if the body's not found and the case kind of just goes away? And is it more exciting for him, the one that wants to create fear in a community? Is it more exciting for him when the body is found? And is that part of what we know about him refining his patterns? I don't know.
Yeah, let's talk about Sarah McDermott. Who was she? When was the last time she was seen alive? And why is Paul Denier's name repeatedly brought up in connection to her disappearance?
Well, Sarah McDermott went missing from the Cannonook railway station in July of 1990. Now, why that was a moment of particular stress for Denier was that his brother David, who he accused of sexually assaulting him, David's always denied that, of course. David had just arrived back from the UK in the May, and this happened in the July. Now, talking to the family back when I was doing the book, there was kind of a family implosion around that time. So they'd taken out restraining orders against each other, and the family were in a time of high stress with the arrival of David in the country. And I feel like if Paul says, I wanted to kill since I was 14, we know that he walks around a lot at night, we know that he's armed, and we know that he frequents train stations. I feel like he should be looked at. We know that Sarah was attacked at her car because there's blood on the ground near her car. We know that the offender dragged her into the bushes. We know that she was left for a considerable amount of time because she had bled quite a lot into the soil, and then her and her bags and all of her belongings vanish. and we know that the blood was DNA tested and it was hers. So what the offender has done is the offender has ignored her car as a instant right there form of transport, has left her in the bushes and gone and found some other vehicle, borrowed a vehicle. So we think maybe the offender was on foot, and she has never been recovered. There was all sorts of talk at the time that maybe she was put into a dumpster, and the tip certainly was just too big to search, given that there was no evidence that that had happened, but it was one of the theories. Now, Daniel wasn't on the radar then, so it's not until 1993 when he's caught that the police kind of interviewed him. He denied everything and then he confessed. And I think that there was always a feeling in the eyes of some of the investigators that, well, we asked him and he said no, and he confessed freely to the other three, but he said no. I question that because we're dealing with a psychopath, and I think that if he did do it, it could be a delicious memory that he keeps to himself. When we did the podcast on Sarah, not one piece of information came through, and I think that's telling because I've done other podcasts and I get flooded. And the only way that no information can come through is if he doesn't tell anyone. But I've since heard that he did in fact talk a lot about Sarah, and she was a topic of conversation once he was incarcerated. So I think this whole, if he did it, he would have told someone, maybe he did. And we need to look at who was around him in prison. And, you know, he threatened one prison guard, a female prison guard, with, when I get out, I want to kill you, and it'll be easy because we can just meet at Cannonook Station. He's telling stories that allude to Sarah. So when people say if it had been him, he would say something, it's like, well, how do you know he's not saying anything? Because my intel says that he is.
In terms of Paul Denyer being on the radar of police eventually, by 1993, how is it that they eventually came to connect him to these crimes and investigate him ultimately? I've heard police speak about, you know, red herrings and other suspects and leads that didn't go anywhere. Was there a sense that time was wasted or lost between these murders because he wasn't on their radar?
Yeah, I think the police had a theory. A young woman, a very troubled young woman with a very violent past called Jodie Jones, had told people that she did it. She, you know, told different stories to different people about, there was 3 guys with me, 1 guy with me, and she was drug affected and she had form. But the police talked to her, they interviewed her, and they didn't get anywhere with that. And then a couple of months later, she overdoses and dies. So I think there was a sense for the police that we think it was her. She looked good for it. She told people she did it. But at the same time, there was $1 million award and no one came forward. And if she was with all of these accomplices and certainly with people in that drug world that could have benefited from reward money, nobody came forward. They shake the tree and nothing drops out. And so when he came on the radar and he confessed to the 3, the cops got him in jail and they went, thank God he's out of the picture. And it's not until 30 years down the track when we're staring down the barrel of a possible release that people are starting to panic. And I think maybe the police are saying, well, we do need to look at him more closely for Sarah, because just because he said he didn't do it, that doesn't mean that he's innocent. And also I've heard from someone who visited him in prison that he talked about having the 3. So he needed the 3 women to be a serial killer, and he had the 3. So in his mind, he was the serial killer. He kind of trades off that in prison. He trades off his notoriety and, you know, I'm the Frankston serial killer. So I don't think there was any reason for him to confess to Sarah. But for the sake of her parents, I really hope that he does. He won't confess if confession is on the table until parole is denied, until they go, Paul, you're going to be in here forever.
On what we've learnt about Paul Denyer based on his time in prison, what you have investigated, what can you tell me about his time in the last 30 years, the information that he's traded on, his reputation, Who is Paul Denyer, the serial killer behind bars?
He's not very well behaved, and he's not popular with female prison guards. He speaks to them really disrespectfully. I guess what he doesn't realise is that they report it. Like every time he speaks to them in ways like threatening to kill them, they're going to go straight and put a report in. So his file, I think, would be growing very thick on the way that he treats female prison guards, which if you're ever applying for parole, that's not a good sign. We know that his friends with Farquharson, who killed his 3 sons. Arthur Freeman is another friend who killed his little daughter by dropping her off the Westgate Bridge. We know that he has been friends in the past with Ray Edmonds. And so the company that he keeps in prison is disturbing. I mean, it's a limited pool, of course, but in the unit where he is, where there's, I think, about 60 or 65 inmates, these are the people that he chooses to hang out with. And I'm told by a retired prison guard that Denyer often will target friends who are coming into the prison if they're high profile. Like it's almost like, oh, if your case made front page news, then you'd be good enough to hang out with me, which is also disturbing. I'm also told, I've heard from several different sources, that when young men come into the prison, he will target them as well for affection. We know that he has been alleged to have committed 2 sexual assaults in prison. His response to these allegations is fury. How dare they target me? I'm so angry, and everyone in here is so angry, but the other prisoners are really mean and they're not talking to me. So what's really interesting about that is that he's totally the victim. You know, if these sexual abuse allegations are true, he sees himself totally as the victim.
He has prolifically written letters during his decades behind bars, and you mentioned earlier that you have received one such letter. What did it say?
Well, I had to write to him in the beginning, in the early days of the book, because I knew that when the book came out, the first question people would ask was, did you interview Denyer? And I had to say that I tried. So I wrote him a letter in jail. One of the detectives had contacted him and said, did you get the letter? And he goes, I tore it up and I flushed it down the toilet. And so I thought, well, that's the end of that. But when we put out the 20th anniversary edition, again, I had to write to him, never expecting an answer, and I got an answer. I got a letter along the lines of, dear Ms. Petraitis, you deserve a respectful response, and I won't cooperate with the book because I intend to write my own true and unbiased account of what happened that's sensitive to all concerned. And if you need any other evidence of what a psychopath is, it's someone who thinks that they could write a true and unbiased account of murdering 3 young women that would be sensitive to their families.
How did that feel for you 20 years later, holding that letter from him written for you?
Look, it's a little bit creepy, but also I think as a researcher, it's just living proof that he doesn't get it. And I think that there's a lot of people who can respond to someone like Denyer and just go, he should be shot, or there's certainly a lot of comments on social media at the moment about how he should be hanged and he should be whatever. We've never advocated for that. It's just keep him locked up where he can't hurt women and can't hurt people in the community. And I think my response has always been measured. But yeah, it is creepy to get a letter from a serial killer, but it's nothing that can ever sort of freak me out or anything like that, because I think you have to be a bit courageous when you do this work, and you have to not give him the power of being able to freak me out. And I reproduced it in the Frankston, I think it was the 25th anniversary edition. I put that letter in just to say to people, here is words from his mouth that should be as disturbing to you as they are to me.
In 2003, so Paul Denyer has been in jail for a decade, he revealed that he was transgender. There were photos that circulated in the media of him wearing pigtails in his hair or appearing to possibly be wearing makeup. That caused a bit of controversy, I suppose, a lot of confusion. trans community advocates having to come out in defence of the treatment, the narrative in the media that played out. What can you tell me about that turn that this story took?
Yeah, when I first heard it, my initial thought was he wants to get into a women's prison and he would be surrounded by victims. But I think back then in 2003, we didn't understand trans issues. We didn't have the same understanding that we do now. And one of the schools of thought was, well, maybe this hatred of women is because he's trying to fight against feeling like he should be one. And it's like, okay, well, that makes sense. I'm always happy to look at more of a scientific conclusion.
Is that a conclusion that Paul tried to draw, or a connection that he made himself?
I think that he did. I think that this, was I actually trying to kill the woman in me? I'm not sure that his thought processes are very deep where this was concerned. We now know that in prison he made weird makeup out of like dirt and moisturiser and stained his fingernails with yellow nicotine butts, cigarette butts, to make it look like he had nail polish on. And so there was a lot of behaviour in prison where he was trying to draw that attention. He had started having homosexual relationships in prison, and I kind of wondered whether he maybe said, well, it's easier in his mind to say, I'm not having these relationships as a man, I'm having these relationships as a woman. I'm Paula, and so I'm a girl with a boyfriend. And I wondered if the kind of trans persona fitted with that narrative. But when I interviewed a woman who had gone to visit him in prison, and he admitted to her that the whole Paula thing was a manipulation. He said, if I do this, people will think of Paula the transgender and not Paul the serial killer. And given that this woman had reached out to him and written to him because she had a member of her own family was transgender and felt a compassion toward him, she was just beside herself. She could not believe that his level of manipulation could be that big. From a writing point of view, when Paul was identifying as Paula, I always referred to him in the present as she, because I thought it's not about who he or she is, it's about who I am, and I would do that for anyone. But it did muddy the waters, and now we know that that was what he had intended to do. It's diabolical in its manipulation.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Emma Gillespie. I'm speaking with award-winning true crime author Vikki Petraitis about Frankston serial killer Paul Denyer. Taking it back a little bit, I want to discuss the three victims, Elizabeth, Deborah, Natalie. Elizabeth in particular, 18-year-old. News reports in the immediate aftermath of her death spoke that her body had been found partially naked. Does that tell us anything about the sort of sensational frenzy around these crimes?
I never knew why she was referred to as semi-naked, because I've seen the crime scene photos and her top certainly was pulled up because she was dragged, but her pants were in place, her shoes were in place. And I just wonder, with this use of language, maybe back in 1993, did we have this awareness of what that does to the families? And the families have all said, and this is really interesting, that the fact that she wasn't sexually assaulted was a huge relief to us in among the horror of losing her. We knew that that final indignity had not happened, and so there was some comfort in that. But I just think when we refer to semi-naked over and over again in news reports, which isn't true, I wonder how that affects family members, because at the end of every news bulletin, and I know this profoundly, there is a family watching, horrified, because they're talking about their own daughter or their own relative.
There does seem to be an implication throughout the reporting that tells a story of a sexually violent case. I know when I started looking into it, I had assumed sexual violence was there and had to dig a little deeper to understand. In terms of the media coverage at the time, more broadly, you lived through it, you were there. What was the relationship between investigators and the media of the day? How prominent was the story?
The story was huge. If you think it's prominent at the moment when the parole bit is happening, you look back in every newspaper, pretty much front page news, serial killer in Frankston. And that just added to the complete and utter fear. Now, you can't not report on it. And the fear was what kept women inside. And maybe there were women that escaped because they weren't walking the streets. It certainly didn't get through to everybody, but it's like saying there's a shark in the water, don't go swimming. Some people will still go, but it was frenzied. It was frenzied.
Did the police need the public at that point, especially in the earlier days after the first murder, 18-year-old Elizabeth? Given that Paul Denyer wasn't yet on their radar, what was the role there of trying to source any information or chase any leads, and why?
Yeah, I think with the police it's always been and continues to this day to be very curated. So Charlie Bazina talks in the podcast about we needed to know what Elizabeth's movements are. So if they put a mannequin up and they get the media involved and then they go, did you see this girl? Of course, the police then get flooded with information and some stories are really unlikely. So they go, help us, and then they'll get 500 people saying, I think I saw her. And then they've got to filter through every single one of those hundreds of reports to figure out which would be more likely. So Charlie talks about one report said that Elizabeth was hitchhiking and they're going, what do we know about her? We don't think she was a hitchhiker. We don't think she would do that. So they have to figure out which are more likely, and they certainly use the media to get people to come forward and give information. So while the media can sometimes be problematic, it's also very, very necessary.
The 90s, it doesn't sound like such a long time ago, but it strikes me that there are so many connections in the story of the crimes of Paul Denyer, the harassing of neighbours, the killing of animals, the stalking and intimidation. Can you give me a bit of a sense of that time before social media, predating everyone having a Wi-Fi connection in their homes, police filing systems not, necessarily talking to each other from station to station or town to town? Do you think this would have been a different investigation if Paul Denyer were active, say in the context of 2023?
That is a great question. I like to think that it would be. I like to think that if Julia, who I talked to in the podcast, if she reported that break-in and the police arrived and said, okay, nothing's actually been stolen, but there's an incredible act of violence in the cutting of the throat on photos and stabbing into furniture, and we need to look at this offender not like someone who's just come in and made a mess. We need to be really, really aware of this. And we need to say, hey, Julia, who do you think it is? And when she says, you know what, I think it's my next door neighbour, Paul, we need to go and take him in for questioning. And we need to look really carefully at what he says. And we need to say to him, you're on our radar, buddy. You do this again, we're going to be right on you. Your name's in the system now. But of course, back then it wasn't. Another thing that I think has changed a lot is as a historic researcher, there was in past investigations, and I've seen this really clearly, an air of the filter of misogyny. And I'll give you an example of this so that you know what I'm talking about. When I talked to a retired investigator and I was doing some media on the Phillip Island case, which I wrote about, one of the retired investigators said to me, he said, oh, Vikki, we know Vivian Cameron suicided. And I said, oh, how do you know that? Because I've been looking at this case for 35 years and that's not really obvious. And he said, well, her husband had just left her. What else did she have left?
Oh, my God.
I know, right? That was pretty much what I said. So what you have to factor in 30 years ago is that there are filters of misogyny. I got the very strong impression for a number of investigators talking about Phillip Island when the women, the friends of Vivian, are saying to the police, Vivian never would have left her children. You've really got to look at this further. And I've had cops say to me, these women, they all just start talking and gossiping. I get the really strong impression that when women start talking, these old male detectives, and I hope that this has really, really changed, I get the feeling that they're just going, yeah, women talking, I'm not listening.
Was there an era of that with Debbie Fream disappearing? You know, she was the mother of a 12-day-old baby, and in the media reports of the time, there is a bit of an implication that, well, maybe it's postnatal depression, maybe she's run off and she's not ready to be a mother.
I think that wasn't an internalised misogyny in as much as the whole world needed to think it was postnatal depression and that she'd run off because that meant she could come back. And if it was anything sinister, that meant she wasn't coming back. So I think all of us, the public, the police, everybody would have wanted it to be that. But I think even with the Frankston case, there was woman after woman after woman who said to me, I told the police I thought it was him and nothing happened. I would really hope that that's very much changed, because now that we have had a Paul Denyer, we are much more aware that there can be a Paul Denyer out there and we need to learn from it.
It took more than 1,500 questions in the interview room after Paul Denyer's arrest for police to crack him. What did they tell you about that process and eventually coming to that breaking point of a confession?
They did an awesome job at cracking him, but they also knew straight away, I think, that they had him. And certainly at the time when I did the book, I interviewed a detective who said when Denyer had opened the wire door for them at his house when they first knocked on his door and they saw the cuts on his hands, they're like, we've got him. So they knew that they did have him. The police photographer who took a picture of his hands at the beginning of the interview, and he had just taken a picture of the piece of skin found at Natalie's autopsy, and he's like, yep, that's what we're looking for. And so it was just a matter of time, and they very patiently, you can see how exhausted they all are, but they very patiently lead this very cocky young man who one of the prison guards said he's watched a couple of cop shows and he's an expert. And I thought, you nailed it, because that's exactly what he's like in this interview. He's very cocky. He says, yeah, I know where I was 7 weeks ago on that night that she went missing. And yep, I've got an alibi for here. I was close to the murder, but it wasn't me. And I think that they just went, yep, you're too cocky. We've just got to break you. And certainly once he figured that they had DNA evidence that would convict him, he started boasting about it.
Once he did take that turn and, as you say, started boasting, in terms of what we know about serial killers, psychology, the psychological experts you've spoken to, was that like a triumph lap for him, like his victory lap around the stadium?
Oh, yeah. It was very much boasting. And what strikes you when you watch this whole interview was that he talks to Rod Wilson and Darren O'Loughlin as if they're buddies, as if they're colleagues. And he also tries to spook them when he says to Rod Wilson, yeah, I drove past and I saw you. And Rod's like, you saw me? Yeah, I drove past, saw you. And there's this sense of you didn't even see me. And he wants to show them the burnt soles of his shoes. Yeah, look, I wanted to fool you guys so that I wouldn't leave shoe impressions because I've burnt the soles of my shoes on the stove. And they're just looking at him going, what? But he certainly thought he was being very clever, but of course he's not, because he gets a life sentence.
Can you tell me how sentencing and the trial of Paul Denyer differed, given that he had confessed, he was entering a guilty plea from the get-go? What was the impact of that?
Look, normally if you enter a guilty plea, there is some sort of automatic reduction, like they say a third reduction on your sentence or whatever. But I think sometimes what you do can be so bad, and as Justice Vincent said in his summing up, you've given up your right to walk among us. You are so dangerous. But unfortunately, as part of that summing up speech, when he says, life sentence, no possibility of ever getting out, Denya's lawyers appealed on a point of law. The judges in the appeals court said, well, you shouldn't have said, I cannot abrogate my responsibility to a future parole board or a legislative body. And because you said that, he has to have a minimum. So when I interviewed Carmel Russell at the time, she said to me and her sister Bernadette, and they were, of course, following it, and she goes, they didn't mention the girls at all. It was not about the girls. It was totally about the law. And they talk then about this canyon between the law and justice, because the girls didn't come into it. It wasn't about the severity of the crime. It wasn't about his possibility to get better. It was purely about taking issue at this point of law, this phrase that was used. And so because of that, we are now where we are today.
That canyon of, a so-called discount for a guilty plea, do you get a sense that there's momentum pushing towards shifting that legislatively? Will we see a future where a guilty plea does not automatically mean bargaining down a sentence?
I think it works in a lot of ways. It certainly saves the court a huge amount of time and money. But I think it goes beyond. There are certain crimes where you just shouldn't ever get out. And if you kill 3 women and you torture kittens and kill animals and stalk women, and that is your whole life's goal, is to do that and create fear in the community, and he did because we were all terrified, I think Denya is such an aberration that we need to have laws that it really just, we could have a serial killer law that says if you kill 3 people, if you're a serial killer, you just never get out. It's too dangerous. I've heard whispers that he now, because of this huge backlash, that he is in fact thinking, well, maybe I won't get out. But I fully believe up until quite recently he thought he would. He thought, well, I've said sorry and, I'm a different person now and I just should be able to get out. But I think this reaction, the huge media interest, says no, you shouldn't ever be out.
Vikki, I'll let you go soon, but I have to, of course, ask you about the families of these victims. The parole bid has unsettled many people in the community. The media attention, the spotlight is back on this case and Paul Denya. But at the heart of this are real people, real families, parents, siblings, loved ones who lost these young women in the most unimaginable of circumstances. I know the word closure is a problematic or a difficult one for families of victims, but what has this bid for parole done to those people?
I'll never forget when Natalie's sister Janine rang me and she said, Vikki, I just want you to know before it hits the media that Carmel O'Brien had received a letter from the Victims Register to say that he had applied. My heart was thumping. I had a physical reaction to it, and I rang Brian and Carmel, and Brian answered, and I'm like, Brian, are you okay? He goes, yeah, we're okay. But I remember Janine saying to me later, she said, when Brian took the call, she said, Carmel, Mum's standing right next to him, just shaking. And a lot of people have said to us, oh, he'll never get out. And I accept that because I feel like that too. But what they don't realise is that I don't even know that the Russells have slept through a night ever since this parole bid has happened. The physical health toll that it takes on people that are Carmel's just about to turn 80. Brian is in his 80s. It's affected Jake. It is incredibly affected Debbie Fream's brother Troy, who I spoke to, and they are beside themselves. It's horrifying. And when we talk about our fight, really, we can't stop this parole bid because the momentum happened. But what we want to do is stop him from being able to apply, because this is torture for all of them.
Why is it important to talk about this case, these families, Paul Denyer and his crimes, all these years later? Your podcast, our podcast, media coverage. Why do we need to pay attention?
We need to get this story out to the world. And every time I get download figures, and today just, 729,000, and I'm like, yes, the world is listening. Because what we want the world to know is that this man is dangerous. And if the whole world can be outraged, then that puts political pressure on the government to, I guess, in the corridors of power. I really hope conversations are happening like, whoa, did you see this coverage? Did you see that nearly 40,000 people have signed a petition? We can't let him out. This is politically going to be bad. And I want those conversations to happen. And so what we do is my podcast, your podcast, we have a voice. And it seems that the world is really interested in this story. So it adds to the voice.
A huge thanks to Vikki for assisting us to tell this story today. And if you'd like to listen to her full investigation of this case with first-hand interviews with prison guards, police officers and family members, you'll find her new podcast, The Frankston Murders, linked in our episode description. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted by me, Emma Gillespie. The executive producer is Gia Moylan with assistant production by Cassie Merritt. Our audio design is by Rhiannon Mooney and Madeline Joannou. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation.